In this section, we'll just run through a brief timeline of events in the 1950s. There's nothing putting this, really holding this together, except we're going in chronological order, and they're just tidbits that are interesting. First, in 1946, scientists figured out how to develop cortisone, which is, of course, a steroid that fights inflammation and is very critical today. In 1947, a farmer in Roswell, New Mexico, found what he thought was a flying saucer, and the media in that town reported it, and it became really a sensation. What it actually was a secret government air balloon, but ever since then, people around Roswell have sighted alien spacecraft, and there's a real tourist industry regarding that today around Roswell. In 1949, at a fashion show in Paris, the first bikini was unveiled. Also in 1949, the playwright Arthur Miller wrote his famous play Death of a Salesman, and Arthur Miller later married Marilyn Monroe. In 1950, the census showed that the American population had passed 150 million, which of course is less than half of what it is today. In 1950, the cartoonist Charles Schulz began a syndicated cartoon known as Peanuts. Also in 1950s, the first antihistamines were introduced. In 1951, the famous baseball player Joe DiMaggio retired after a 13-year career that included the longest hitting streak to that day. He later married Marilyn Monroe. In 1951, the first heart-lung machine was used in an operation in Cincinnati. That same year, the author J.D. Salinger published his famed novel Catcher in the Rye. In 1952, the first heart pacemaker was introduced. In 1953, the publisher Hugh Hefner published his first Playboy magazine with Marilyn Monroe on the cover. In 1953, the first color TVs were marketed. Thing is, though, there weren't a whole lot of shows in color, so they really didn't spread until a little bit later. Also in 1953, Ray Bradbury published his famous novel Fahrenheit 451, which was a depiction of a dystopian future America where they burned books, and Fahrenheit 451 was supposedly the temperature at which paper would spontaneously combust. In 1953, Francis Crick and James Watson discovered the helical structure of the DNA. Actually, it wasn't American, it was at the University of Cambridge, but Watson wasn't American, and Frick was British. In 1954, you had the first organ transplant in Boston, also happened in Paris, but in Boston of two living people. It was a kidney that was transplanted from one living person to another. A kidney had been transferred from a cadaver to a living person successfully a few years earlier. In 1956, the first TV remote was unveiled. That same year, the famous actress Grace Kelly married the Monaco Prince Rainier in a very celebrity-studded marriage. In 1957, Ayn Rand published her novel Atlas Shrugged, which was another dystopian American future where basically the government and regulations had gotten so hard that it killed free markets, industries had collapsed. It's a real famous novel for arch conservatives today. On a little lighter note, Dr. Seuss published his Cat in the Hat in 1957. In 1958, you begin to see the first commercial regular use of jet airline passenger service. The first flight in the United States was from New York to Miami, and there was also the first international jet flight that year. The first hula hoops began in 1958. They became a rage among young people. The first Lego block toys were invented in 1958, but they really didn't catch on for a while. In 1958, the American Bobby Fischer became the youngest chess grandmaster ever, defeating a Russian. In 1958, Jack Kirby, who worked for Texas Instruments, invented the first integrated circuit, which of course was a bunch of electronic circuits on one small plate, or they say chips. And also in the 1950s, International Business Machines, IBM, developed Fortran, a new programming language for numerical computing. Both the integrated circuit and Fortran were very important to the development of the first significant computers. The next year, in 1959, there was the first Daytona 500 car race. 1959 was the last year that a state entered the United States, and actually that year, two states entered. Hawaii was the final state to enter just after Alaska. And most importantly of all, in 1959, your professor was born. That concludes this section, sort of a jog through of interesting tidbits of the 1950s.